Good day. This is Dave Small, president of the Outlaw Bird Nature Club, and we're here today for our first video webinar. And we want to thank our friends at the New England Grassroots Environmental Fund for funding a grant that gives us the opportunity to do some community outreach, which included the ability to do webinars. So today's guest is Dr. Mike Jones, who's our state herpetologist, and he's going to take us through the species of turtles that inhabit the mainland of Massachusetts. So without further ado, we're going to hear from Mike Jones. And my apology that the beginning of this, I forgot to hit the record button. So the technology is great, but there is a human factor. Okay, thank you very much, and enjoy the webinar.
In terms of turtle conservation. Hopefully you know some of these people. I think if you're active in Massachusetts, you may have crossed paths with some of them. The last 3 or 4 decades, there's been a lot of attention given to Massachusetts turtles and Massachusetts turtle conservation. And in some areas, we're seeing promising signs that those efforts are paying off. And I wanted to mention one other thing. I try to just be aware of everything that's happened before me. Massachusetts published one of the first herpetology or turtle compendia ever. This is in 1840. This is an original Humphrey's Storer, The Reptiles of Massachusetts. It's humbling to read because they had a lot figured out 180 years ago. Another one that's interesting, if you're homebound, you can find copies of Louis Agassiz's Contributions to the Natural History of North America. It has a lot of Massachusetts turtle information in it. Again, just sort of a fascinating volume to be aware of, and it's humbling to know how much they knew so long ago. And then almost exactly 100 years ago, this is Harold Babcock's Turtles of New England. Again, it has spectacular color plates, and it just shows that they had a pretty good grasp of what was going on at the time. So without further ado, yeah, most people, who are interested in the natural world probably know that this is a tough time of year for turtles. They're up and about, they're trying to nest. It's June 10th. This is just about, on average these days, it's just about when the nesting season really gets going. So most of our freshwater turtles are up and nesting. Snapping turtles are nesting in the morning. A lot of our rare turtles are nesting in the evening. A lot of them are getting killed on roads. I've seen many already this year. So if you haven't noticed turtles on the road, keep an eye out. They're out there. And we're right in the middle of that season. And I'll talk a little bit more about ways to get involved in the turtle road crossing issue, which is a really big, concern for most species. And I wanted to mention another time-sensitive, sort of relevant news update. This is from CBS Boston yesterday. A Worcester man pleaded guilty, federal court, for smuggling Massachusetts turtles. This is really discouraging to know that that this is going on right here under our noses. Commercial illegal harvest of Massachusetts turtles and export to other countries. So I wanted to give a nod to the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement who pursued this for many years before finally bringing it to some closure yesterday. All right, so this is easier to do in a in-person format, but if you're willing to play along, how many turtle species in total do we have in Massachusetts? If anyone wants to chat. And don't worry, I won't let that go on too long. Here's my count. I come up with something between 16 and 18. The 10 species I mentioned before that you can find on the mainland. We have 4 sea turtle species that are found with some regularity in Cape Cod Bay and Nantucket Sound. And we have 2 turtles that are very clearly introduced to the state. There are asterisks next to the sea turtles and the introduced turtles because there's another sea turtle, the hawksbill, that's been reported from Massachusetts. And there are some signs that the Chinese softshell is establishing itself in Massachusetts. So that's something to watch. So hold that thought. The turtles I really want to focus on today are those 10 non-marine turtles, the turtles that you can find on the mainland of Massachusetts from Cape Cod to the Berkshires. And let's jump right in. So of those 10, 6 are considered sufficiently endangered to be listed on the state endangered species list. Those are the ones shown at the left, that colorful familiar group there. On the right are the 4 species that are not listed. They have They're not currently listed under the State Endangered Species Act. This is another way of seeing them broken out. Of those 10, 8 are very closely related. They're all within the family Emididae. Sometimes we'll hear that word pronounced Emidid. I say Emididae, Emidid turtles. These are the pond turtles. They're mostly found in North America. There are a few species in South America and 1 species in Europe. But for the most part, these are found mostly in the United States and Mexico. We have 2 species that are not in that group and are distantly related, the common snapping turtle and the musk turtle. So hold that thought for a moment. I want to show you sort of how they're related and what time scale we're talking about. If you don't look at these sorts of evolutionary trees a lot, I apologize. They're actually pretty fascinating to me if you dig into them. What this tree shows, let me try, bear with me for one moment. Hopefully you can see me marking up my slide here. What this tree shows are the 4 groups of turtles that you'll find here in Massachusetts, with the Emidids being the most plentiful, the most rich in the state. And what this tree tells us is we have to go back to this point to see where they diverged from all of the other turtles. So this is a hypothesis, sort of the most current hypothesis, that says the turtles that are most familiar to us in Massachusetts today, the painted turtles, the spotted turtle, the box turtle, the Emidids, broke off from the other turtles we're familiar with about 100 million years ago. So that was deep in the Cretaceous. The dinosaurs still had 35 million years to roam around. It was a bizarrely different time, and clearly beyond our ability to imagine. But that's sort of the window when it seems like a lot of the radiation occurred that leads us to the diversity we see today. Bear with me. Okay. So this is my own personal photograph of the Cretaceous. This is at Kings Canyon National Park in a giant sequoia forest. It was just a reminder that it really is beyond our ability to comprehend or even creatively imagine what the world was like when the snapping turtles, the musk turtles, the sea turtles were beginning to take their evolutionary form. And just to drive it home a different way, and some of you might find these these anecdotes sort of unacceptable or over the edge, but I think this one is interesting. Take another familiar species. This is the spotted turtle. We think that this animal has been on its own evolutionary path for 20 million years, so it has been isolated or separate reproductively from its most common, its closest relatives for 20 million years. Here it is today. So there's been something like a spotted turtle for many millions of years, leading to the animals that we see today in an evolutionary sense. The American mastodon is an example, and the American megafauna that disappeared at the end of the Pleistocene has only been gone for 11,000 years. That represents 0.5% of the entire evolutionary trajectory, the entire independent trajectory of the spotted turtle. So the animals are living in a context and time with the Pleistocene megafauna gone. That's wholly different from the past several million years. So even without the human infrastructure, roads and development and hydrological alterations and climate change, these animals are already in a pretty novel context in an evolutionary sense. Hopefully that resonates or makes some sense. Okay, the turtle's closest relatives seem to be the crocodiles and birds. So together, the crocodiles and birds form a group, and then with turtles, they form a group called the Archelosauria, which sort of diverged from its closest relatives about 250 million years. So I'm trying to frame this, and however you look at it, these are very old groups, but there's a little bit of nuance. So when you say how old are turtles, it depends on what turtles you're talking about and exactly what you're interested in. So turtles are more closely related to birds, probably, than they are to lizards and snakes, and certainly than they are to the amphibians. But nevertheless, we have this very sort of intractable science, or this field that isn't going anywhere, called herpetology. It's centuries old. It's a bit of an artifact. It's the study of amphibians, the frogs and salamanders and caecilians, and the reptiles, the snakes, lizards, crocodiles, turtles, tuatara, so on. This is what's called a polyphyletic group. It's just a wastebasket of different animals that are unrelated, grouped together for convenience. And it holds today. I'm the state herpetologist in Massachusetts, and many states have a designated herpetology lead. So this would probably irritate some purists that this persists today, but it's worth pausing to think that we approach these animals because they're unlike anything else, not so much because they're like each other. There are about 360 living turtles in 14 families. 4 of those families are here in Massachusetts. This is a global map of turtle richness. Again, this is going to work for some of you and not for others, so let me orient you again. Can you see my mouse? I hope you can. Of course, so this is North America here and South America. We're just looking at a global map, and the sea turtles are excluded from this, but all of the white space on the continent shows places that have no turtles. And all of the purple places show the richest turtle hotspots. So today, the richest places for turtles on Earth, by which I mean the most species, something like 18 or 19 species, is here in the Ganges Brahmaputra on the Indian border. And over here in Alabama, in the Mobile Delta, these are the 2 places on Earth that have the most species co-occurring together. And one of the reasons I pause on that for a moment is we have 10 non-marine species, plus the sea turtles, plus the introduced turtles. So for such a northern state, we have really remarkable turtle richness. There aren't many places at our latitude, 42 degrees north, that have as many turtle species. Hopefully you can see, for instance, at the same latitude in Europe, there are more turtles in Massachusetts than there are in all of Eastern Canada or in all of Europe combined. So it's an interesting sort of biogeographic anomaly. And one of the reasons for that, can you all see my map okay, or is there something blocking it? One of the reasons for that is we're really right at the absolute northern edge of the Atlantic coastal plain. Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, the islands are sort of the last exceptional northern outlier of the Atlantic coastal plain, and a number of our turtles are associated with the coastal plain, like the Diamondback terrapin, the red-bellied cooter, the red-bellied turtle, and the spotted turtle. And so the fact that the coastal plain is juxtaposed with the Appalachian ranges in such a small area, we have a number of turtle species co-occurring in a small area. In general, across the North American continent, you don't find turtles north of 48 degrees north latitude. That's about northern Maine, extreme northern Minnesota. North of that, you really tend not to find any species at all. And the only other place in the North American continent, other than the Arctic and alpine regions, is the Great Basin that has no native species of turtle. So another thing that we'll talk about as we go along is, again, for a relatively small state, Massachusetts is very diverse. So we've already talked about the Atlantic coastal plain. Bear with me for a moment. So we have several distinct ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, including the Taconic Range on the New York border, the Berkshire Plateau, the uplands of the Worcester Plateau here, the big basalt ridges of the Connecticut Valley, and then these interwoven valleys, the Housatonic here, the Hoosic, the Connecticut, the Taunton. And so this, rich Appalachian diverse state has the sufficient landscape diversity to support a lot of different habitats. So one of the things that's intriguing to me is we have these 10 species of turtle. Nowhere in Massachusetts can you find all 10 together. Historically, probably as many as 8 co-occurred in some areas, but for the most part, they're restricted to different parts of the state. This is what it looks like if you overlay all of those ranges together. And so the white numbers tell you how many turtles should be expected in a certain area. So between Athol and Amherst, between sort of Miller's Valley and the Connecticut Valley, you might expect 5 or 6 species of turtle. There are more as you get closer to Boston. And the area where there may once have been 8 species co-occurring is down here in northern Plymouth County. So I'd like to transition now to these sort of targeted species descriptions. Again, I think these animals are really fascinating. I'll try to share for each one of them just some experience of working with them in the field, some of what we are trying to do to conserve them in the most sort of strategic and quantitative way. And then more importantly, I think, is just share enough images that if you haven't seen this animal a lot, or if you haven't seen it in the wild, you hopefully leave this with just a little more familiarity with each of them. So let's start in Plymouth County. I'd like to talk about 3 related turtles, and this is the northern red-bellied cooter, which used to be called the Plymouth red-bellied turtle. This is an enormous female. They're called the red-bellied cooter because their plastron, or the underside, really is bright red. Oftentimes, as you get further south, they can be dingier or discolored, but a lot of the red bellies in Massachusetts are really strikingly red. We get a lot of turtles reported to us as red bellies that are actually painted turtles. So here we have just an assortment of Massachusetts painted turtles on the left, the beige yellow ones, and then an assortment of Massachusetts red bellies on the right. So they're even though sometimes the painted turtle plastron or underside can be pinkish or pinkish beige, they're really never like a red belly plastron. Let me go back to this again. This is a male on the right. Males and females look different from the underside. The male tends to have that dark mottling on the plastron, and they're a little bit smaller than the female. This is something you see in this group that we're talking about. This is a subgroup within the Emididae, that big group that is most of the species in Massachusetts. And we have 3 species in this group, the red belly that we're talking about now, the painted turtle, and the diamondback terrapin. And in all 3 of those cases, the female is larger. So up here is Plymouth County. This is the outlying population of the Plymouth red-bellied cooter. I made this map to show you where the other related turtles live. These are the other North American cooters, which go all the way down to the Rio Grande Basin. There are 9 species. And so this shows you the cooters are in the genus Pseudemes, and they can pretty much be found from the Rio Grande all the way to Massachusetts, and then they come to an absolute halt in Plymouth County, Mass. So I hope this conveys just some of the continental context and shows you that a lot of these species that run out in Massachusetts can be found over very large parts of the country. And I'm sorry, this map isn't showing the species we're talking about. This is showing the genus, so that next level up, all 9 of the North American cooters. This is the northern red-bellied cooter range. So again, up here you can see Cape Cod and Cape Cod Bay and Plymouth County. And then this is the primary range of the northern red-bellied cooter, sort of from central New Jersey to the outer banks of North Carolina. This is where it does best and is most widespread. And there's about a 200-mile gap. So the females can become really large, more than 10 pounds. They can become very domed with a big black vaulted shell. The males can take on this sort of salmon mottled color. And I wanted to call your attention, one way to tell the red bellies from other related turtles is they have this bicuspid, they have 2 cusps on their jaw. I hope you can see my mouse, but if not, you can see these sort of 2 tooth-like projections on the beak. No turtles have teeth. It's been hundreds of millions of years since there's been a toothed turtle. So anything that looks like a tooth is just a projection of the beak. Some of the males can become really strikingly red. So if you're paddling in Plymouth County and you have polarized lenses on, occasionally you can actually see a very big red turtle swim under you. It's a truly striking, memorable thing. But the males can also be a very dark black. They can be a melanistic, completely pigmentless, or completely pigmented. This is again showing this is a female open mouth. So you can see that cusp on the jaw. And for comparison, this is a peninsula cooter here from Florida, and you can see that upper jaw. So 5 of the North American cooters don't have that bicuspid serration on the beak. Okay, so this is a turtle. So we've just completed a multi-year reassessment of how this animal is doing. It's one of the most endangered turtles in Massachusetts. It's listed on the state and the federal Endangered Species Act. This is a turtle that was first captured in 1972 and was recaptured in 2015 in Massachusetts. So we believe it to be between 60 and 70 years old, which is probably the longevity record for this particular species. Hopefully this is familiar to at least some of you, but Massachusetts, MassWildlife, the state agency, has maintained a really active Headstarting program. This is one of the sort of urgent interventions I was talking about earlier. This goes back to 1985. Since 1985, nests have been protected in the wild. The hatchlings taken from those nests in August and September, raised by schools and institutions throughout Massachusetts mostly, and then released in May of the following year. So as of 2 weeks ago, we've released 4,500 head-started red-bellied cooters into southeastern Massachusetts. And one of the reasons why that's significant is when the species was listed in 1980, there were believed to be between 200 and 300 remaining. So the number put out is almost 20 times the number that were believed to be there in 1980 when it was federally listed. So it's a...
Mike, are these just in Plymouth County, or do they go out of the Cape now too?
No, they're not on the Cape. There have been a couple of odd sightings on the Cape, but they're none past the canal. There might be a few in Barnstable County, technically on the west side of the canal, but they're none east of the canal.
Thank you.
There are fossils all over eastern Massachusetts, so it's clear that about 6,000 years ago, I'll tell the short version. It's clear that about 6,000 years ago, they were in Ipswich, up around Rowley, Ipswich in Essex County, Sudbury, Westboro, Martha's Vineyard, possibly Noshawn Island. So there's evidence that about 6,000 years ago, they were very widespread in the state. But when they were first found, which was about 105 years ago, 1915, there was the first time they were scientifically reported in Massachusetts. They were in only 12 ponds, mostly in the town of Plymouth, not just Plymouth County. So today you can see them in Miles Standish State Forest, Burridge Pond Wildlife Management Area. There are a number of places where you can see them if you go with binoculars or kayak. So a study that I did with John Regeson and Liz Wiley and others, we went into ponds that were only established with head starts. So there were no native populations there as far as we knew. And we estimated the surviving number of head-started turtles and found that it averaged about 95% annually, ranging from 90% to 98%, which if you're trying to figure out how a turtle population is doing, there's a really big difference between 90% annual survivorship and 98% annual survivorship. And to just give an example of that, if you took our averaged estimated survivorship rate and applied it annually to the 4,500 head starts that have been put out, then there should be at least 2,222 surviving, or about 49% of the head starts that have been put out since 1984 should still be surviving. However, the pessimistic estimate, if we apply that survivorship estimate, there would be only 1,300, 1,400 left. And the more optimistic estimate suggests that there might be 3,280, on that order of magnitude surviving, or 71% of the animals put out. So our judgment, my judgment, is that that average estimate is probably about right. And so the population of red-bellies in the last 40 years is at least 10 times larger than it was in 1980. And that doesn't account for the reproduction that we know is occurring. Okay, this is such a stunning animal. I'm shifting gears. I wanted to give a little bit of attention to the painted turtle. It's often observed. It's often misidentified. It's often sort of ignored roadside. I mean, I am maybe hyper tuned into turtle roadkill because of my job, but many, many thousands of painted turtles die each year on Massachusetts highways. And oftentimes they can be an indicator of where there's a bigger roadkill problem going on for species that are more rare, like Blanding's turtle, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this is a very close relative of the red-bellied cooter, but it's not endangered in any sense. We believe it to be widespread, stable, and secure. It's on most of the Massachusetts islands, so you can find it throughout the Elizabeth Islands, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Monomoy. Massachusetts has a lot of islands, of course, and so one measure of how widespread a turtle is how many of those islands it's found on. So most of those islands have painted and snapping turtles, and a few of them have spotted turtle. A lot of our painted turtles are what's called the eastern painted turtle, which has a clean or whitish unmarked underside. Others look more like the Midland painted turtle, which have this sort of ornate bruise on their plastron. This is what turtles look like in Ontario and Michigan and Wisconsin. And Massachusetts, it's clear that we had sort of two types of painted turtles that have been mixing for a long time. So even in one population, This is a population in Andover. You can see animals that look like eastern painted turtles on the bottom, and then a couple that look like they have some influence of the Midland painted turtle at the top. But again, if an animal is killed on a road, even a very small fragment of a turtle should be identifiable as an eastern painted turtle by that red and black marginal rim, the pale colored plastron. This is a nesting painted turtle in Andover. And again, this is happening right as we speak in a gravel pit near you. Painted turtles will nest through the day, and you'll find them on roadsides, in gravel pits, sand and gravel pits, power lines. They're a pretty versatile nester. Some of our other turtles are a little bit more picky in terms of the substrate that they'll nest in. But painted turtles will nest in lawns, in sand, in mulch. I'm sure many of you have come across them probably even this year. They've been out in numbers for more than a week. And they still have several weeks to go. This animal reaches its northernmost distribution in Massachusetts. This is the Diamondback terrapin. It's just an exquisite creature wherever it's found. It's found from Wellfleet Bay on Cape Cod all the way down to Corpus Christi, Texas. It's not found in Mexico. It's not found in New Hampshire, so it comes to a stop in Massachusetts. We have a number of populations on Cape Cod, in Buzzards Bay, and in the lower Taunton River. The Massachusetts turtles are oftentimes very vibrantly colored. This is a female. Here's another one, another striking animal. They're found in salt marshes on the shore, tidal creeks, lagoons, open bays. They can move miles within a season. The females, again, like the other two we just talked about, are much larger than the male. This is an unusually colored animal from Wellfleet. Really striking. And they're just stunning creatures. And there are some promising signs in parts of Cape Cod that the animal is, if not stable, at least encountered regularly. And then there's some areas where it looks like the populations are still very small. But Massachusetts has so much suitable or potentially suitable shoreline habitat for this species that there are still a lot of restoration opportunities to be had. This is an animal from Connecticut. It's a bit darker than the animals I was just showing from the Cape. Here's another Connecticut female up looking for a place to nest. And just in the interest of time, I'll keep moving. So we just talked about a little subgroup of the amidids. I said there were 8 amidids in Massachusetts, and we just talked about 3 of them that are closely related. But there's another group, excuse me, and these are called the imidines. This is actually a subfamily within the Amididae family. I know this is all technical, but one of the reasons why it's interesting is Massachusetts and New York have more of these species than any other place on Earth. So this is most of the living group here, and we have 5 species, and that's more than any other state, province, or country. So I'd like to go through them. There's sort of 4 natural groups. That doesn't matter so much, but I wanted to talk about each of them because they're uniformly of concern pretty much wherever they occur to some degree. This is Blanding's turtle. You should know it right away by that sort of domed army helmet carapace or shell, and this really striking yellow throat. This is a pretty consistent trait. Here's a male underwater, and again, you can see that really striking yellow throat. A healthy wild individual, it can be extremely bold. So Blanding's turtles can be spotted. This is a female Blanding's turtle from Wisconsin. I'd describe that pattern as spotted, but they can be sort of patternless or reticulated or kind of worm-like patterns. This is a big male from southeastern Massachusetts, and again, you can see that really distinctive diagnostic throat. For some reason, this is another species that's misidentified really often. It's skittish. It likes deep water. It's hard to get close to it. But that yellow throat is oftentimes a diagnostic giveaway. This is an animal that I photographed just while we were processing it, and it happened to be on its back. I think we were weighing it. So this is you can see that there's several things about this underside that are very different from a painted turtle, which is the species you're most likely to encounter where Blanding's turtles are found. First of all, there's a hinge here. So if you can see where my cursor is, the plastron is actually divided into 2 lobes, and they're very slightly movable. The whole thing floats like this. So it's not like an eastern box turtle that can completely close up, but there's some sign that this is partial kinesis. It's a little bit mobile. And Blanding's turtles, unless they're stained, this is an animal from Iowa, and it's stained with sort of tannins, but they always have these black blotches on the plastron. A big male with those sort of worm-like reticulations on the carapace. Blueberry swamp. So Blanding's turtles are found in a wide range of habitats in eastern Massachusetts primarily. Most of our populations are in Worcester, Middlesex, and Essex counties in the northeastern part of the state, but they tend to be found in the highest numbers in shrub swamps, dominated by things like buttonbush or highbush blueberry, or leatherleaf, plants like that, rhodora. And oftentimes they live in these sort of mosaics of sphagnum habitats, shrub swamps, emergent wetlands where you would find things like tussock sedge. So exceptional places. They like open areas. All of the turtles in this group are drawn into openings in ways that sometimes are catastrophic, but sometimes seem to be benign or harmless. This is one of those examples where there's a power line right of way and an open shrub swamp underneath it. And the turtles seem to be drawn into this area probably because there are more foraging opportunities and more opportunities to bask and get their temperature up. So just a few other shots of Blanding's turtle habitat. They live in vernal pools. This is a vernal pool in Middlesex County, really very typical Blanding's turtle habitat in that part of the state. I threw this one in, not because it's in Massachusetts, but to show where they are most abundant anywhere in their range. This is out in Nebraska in the Sandhills, the Valentine Refuge. So here they're found in sort of monocultures of cattail, and they can become really abundant in these potholes in the shortgrass prairie. So just to provide some additional context. This wonderful looking thing is their closest living relative. So this is found throughout Oregon and Northern California. So Blanding's turtles' closest relative is found in California. And there are two species out there. There's this one, and there's this one, which is found from Baja California up to like Santa Barbara. And these are the sorts of habitats that it lives in. And again, I just show you that for context to put the Blanding's turtle into some bigger picture. And there's one other close relative, and this is one of the biogeographic enigmas of the turtles. This is the only one of this group that made it to Europe. And so the European pond turtle is one of the closest relatives to Blanding's turtle. Many people would say it's in the same genus, and it's found from the Iberian Peninsula all the way to Iraq, and it's also found in North Africa. So it's got this incredibly wide distribution throughout Southern Europe, and there are a lot of competing hypotheses about how it got there, but it probably got there via Alaska, via a Bering land bridge several million years ago. Okay, so you can ignore most of what's on this map, but here in pink or in red is the range of Blanding's turtle. So the interesting thing is you can see that our population in New England is really isolated. It's sort of a small isolated fragment. There's another one out here in Nova Scotia. There are at least two in the Hudson Valley of New York. And then this is really an animal of the Great Lakes and the prairie. Otherwise. So I'd like to talk for a moment about the spotted turtle. So by contrast, if you can remember the range of Blanding's turtle, spotted turtle does have a little Great Lakes component here from Illinois to Western Pennsylvania, but primarily it's found from mid-coast Maine to just north of Orlando and mostly on the Atlantic coastal plain. It's found throughout most of the state in Massachusetts. It's on many of our offshore islands. It's not in the high elevations of the Berkshires. It's about the only place that it wasn't found historically. Males and females, their faces are colored differently. So in this group of turtles, different from the red-belly and the painted turtle and the terrapin, the males are often larger. The females can be larger too. It's not quite as clear of a dimorphic signature, but more often the males are larger. This is a male on the left who has this sort of slaty brown face and brown eyes. This is a female spotted turtle on the right that has the orange, pale beige face and orangish colored eyes. This is so clear that after you've thought about it a bit, you can tell males from females when they're basking at a distance if you have binoculars and can see any part of their face. So is this a male or a female? I'm guessing everyone said females. Yeah, so this is not just any female either. This is one we're studying again, sort of a partnership effort between several different entities, and Patrick Roberts, who's a PhD student at UMass, is leading the charge. This is an animal that has a radio this summer and is being radio tracked as part of a much bigger study, but was first radio tracked in the summer of 1993. This is part of a bigger study of several species to try to locate individual turtles that were first tracked 20 or 30 years ago and see how their ranges have shifted. There's not a lot of empirical evidence to support this yet, but it's pretty clear that spotted turtles can probably live 70 to 100 years and maybe even more. Again, typical spotted turtle habitat in Massachusetts, tussock swamps, the edges of shrub swamps. There's some overlap with Blanding's turtle, but oftentimes they're in separate areas. This is a place where spotted turtles are still relatively secure and common, in my judgment, in southeastern Mass. This is one of the offshore islands of Massachusetts. It's a moraine feature. It's one of the older moraines of the big ice sheet that came down into Massachusetts and ended at Cape Cod or just south of it. So this is a big pile of glacial debris off in the Atlantic Ocean, and there are spotted turtles that live up on top of it. There's some signs that the population is stable, but there are other signs that the island is eroding in a way that some of the wetlands the spotted turtles are using are slipping into the ocean during big winter storms. So this is a component of sea level rise that I hadn't really thought of, or a manifestation of the way erosion is working in Massachusetts that we should probably keep an eye on. So I already alluded to this study. This is I actually did my senior thesis 20 years ago on a population in Amherst. This is a female that I marked when I was in college, or that I photographed when I was in college. It was actually part of an earlier study. And then this is her last year. So I think 18 or 19 years later, the same female, F100. I've seen her so many times that when I see her in the wetland and I'm out there, I know it's her without even having to pick her up. So hopefully you can separate out the fact that the image on the left is an old analog slide, Ektachrome, and then on the right we've transitioned finally. Let me share a couple updates from this study we've gone. So Massachusetts had a number of studies in the 80s and 90s that were pretty significant. One was done by Dr. Terry Graham in Worcester County, and he published this paper in 1995. Another paper came out, by Joan Milam and Scott Melvin. This paper came out in 2001, but these studies were describing work that was done in the 80s and 90s. And so as part of this team I described earlier, we've put together an effort to go back and reassess, what's happening at those two reference populations that we have a lot of good information for. These are both protected sites, so there's not really any reason to have suspected they were declining, and they're not really representative of what's going on the larger Massachusetts landscape. So first, the site in Worcester County. In 1989, Dr. Graham estimated that there were 98 turtles in that population. And now almost exactly 30 years later, our estimate is very similar. So we captured about 1.5 to 2 times as many turtles as he did. And our estimate suggests that the population is very similar in size. You have to interpret these very cautiously. I'm not trying to say that this population is stable. It's just part of the picture. But I also read this as an encouraging piece of information. The other study I mentioned, the details I'd be really happy to talk about with anyone if you would like to discuss later. Let me just skip ahead. The other study by Joan Milam and Scott Melvin, these are their published estimates from 1994 and 1995. This is when I went back and did my senior thesis. This is a follow-up study that we did with the original author. And then this is more recently in 2018. So the red site is in Franklin County, Mass. And there's some signs here, if you just look at the first estimate in 94 and the current estimate, that this population is at least about the same size, if not slightly larger. The other one was starting to concern us because as the decades went by, we seemed to find that it was declining. The most recent estimate, even though there's a large error margin, suggests maybe that turtles have moved back into that area, or we missed them on an earlier assessment. So another thing that we're looking at, and again, this is Patrick Roberts' PhD work, is the turtles that we're recapturing that were first radio tracked in the 90s. We're tracking them again and looking at their home ranges. Obviously, this is a really tough thing to study because the turtles that would move farthest have left the system. But if they left in a sort of normal distribution, then we should be finding animals at some distance from the study site, which we have. So this is a very exploratory, descriptive study to just get a sense of how they're using new features that have opened up and major landscape changes that have happened in the intervening years. Again, a partnership with Patrick Roberts, Liz Wiley, and others. So this is our rarest turtle. It's the one I'm concerned most about. We're down to 2 sites. We heavily manage this habitat with the Nature Conservancy. We're actually giving a separate webinar, I think, 2 weeks from now on the bog turtle. So this is the bog turtle. It's only found in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. This is a spotted turtle on the left and a bog turtle on the right. So even though they're in 2 different genera, they're similar looking. And for decades, they were placed in the same genus together, Clemmies. This is how they appear more often than not. Hopefully you can see him right here at image center. So this is a male just peering out. We knew he was there because he also has a radio on. So we're doing radio telemetry with the Nature Conservancy to evaluate how they're responding to habitat management. This is a species that has so many threats, I couldn't even name them all now. Collectors, cars, mowers, beavers, predators, raccoons, minks, disease. It's really remarkable that they're still in Massachusetts, and these are one of our highest priorities to get right in the coming years. And they're one of the smallest turtles on Earth. A really, really big adult is still under 4 inches. And you can tell them from other species by that really prominent orange blotch on the side of the head. They're usually found in these sort of mucky calcareous swamps, but they can be found in the clear rivulets that flow through these fens. And this is another place where, you know, the science is catching up with the animal's life history. A number of these animals were first marked in 1985, 1986, 1987 by Dr. Michael Clemens, and we're still finding those animals today. So this is my awkward segue into its closest relative. The bog turtle here is shown in orange. So you can see it just barely comes into southwestern Massachusetts and has this sort of fragmented range that suggests the whole thing is in retreat. It's kind of collapsing everywhere. It's not a good situation range-wide. And then in red is its closest living relative, the wood turtle, which is much more widespread, found in much larger habitat areas. It seems to require much more space. It's a much, much, much larger animal. But in some ways it appears similar. You can tell, even a layperson can tell that it's probably closely related to the one we were just looking at. This is a female in a big summer thunderstorm waiting to nest. This is a very typical looking wood turtle, so a juvenile, a young animal, a subadult. But compared to the bog turtle, which has the big orange blotch on the side of its head, the wood turtle has this really striking red-orange coloration. That's only true in the Appalachians, though. So this is not a coastal plain species. The first point I wanted to make is we don't even have any records of the wood turtle from the coastal plain of Massachusetts. Right where the spotted turtle seems to start doing okay, we lose the wood turtle completely. An Appalachian region wood turtle is shown on the right, but once you get out into the Great Lakes, they take on this very dull orange hue, yellowish hue, which you can see on the left. So these are 2 females, a Minnesota female and a Maine female on the right. This whole group that we're talking about here, the males have an indented or concave plastron. This is another character that I often hear improperly assigned to painted turtles. That first group we talked about, they don't have this character. So the males having an indented or concave underside is only in these 5 species we're talking about right now: Blandings, bog, spotted, wood, and the next one, the eastern box turtle. You can also see this male has a much larger, thicker tail than the female. And the rear margin of the carapace, so we're looking at them, they're both on their backs. The rear margin of the carapace is flared and wider than the female. They can be extremely variable. So these are all animals from central New England. These are all males. And depending on whether, what time of year, how old the animal is, what the stream is like, whether it's wet or dry, the animal can be really variable. So again, this is an animal that is occasionally misidentified as a Blanding's turtle or an eastern box turtle because they can be so vividly colored. But they're a stream turtle, so while a lot of our other turtles have their own sort of specific habitat niches, the wood turtle's really in clear, cold, mid-sized trout streams. And most of the management conflict happens because in an ordinary context, or in an undeveloped, unfragmented context, wood turtles are drawn to open areas like this one at the top. This is a false hellebore community. It's open in an alder swale. It's influenced by beavers. It's a very large landscape. This is an ostrich fern ice scour meadow. So this is along a big river in Massachusetts where the river actually, the spring freshets scour the bank, and wood turtles use those areas. They love these open herbaceous habitats. So here's a photograph of a wood turtle in situ as photographed. This is very typical April, May habitat. And the problem is, and this remains a difficult conundrum, whenever there's agriculture right near these cold, clear trout streams that are low gradient, the wood turtles are drawn in, and then they can be killed en masse by tractors or mowers. So this remains a tricky problem. These are just some of the places where we lost radioed wood turtles in Massachusetts. So potato fields, pasture, hayfield, cornfield, all of these present pretty significant risks. And another risk to the wood turtle probably is affecting this one at the population level more than many of our others is illegal collection. So I haven't even updated this graph, but the real price that wood turtles are fetching in an illegal black market trade is going up. That's suggesting there's just more and more pressure on this animal. There have been a number of recent confiscations. I'm just showing some of them, but this number of animals is larger than most Massachusetts populations. So just remember this. This is the problem with this isn't that, isn't necessarily that hundreds and hundreds of wood turtles are coming out of Massachusetts. It's that they're likely coming from our best populations that might only have 30 or 40 wood turtles remaining and have many people working to conserve the landscape, and it can be so easily undermined by illegal collectors. So this is something I hope we see much more attention on in the coming years. And that case in Worcester suggests that at least the federal authorities who have a lot of the ability to prosecute these cases are taking it seriously. Because a lot of the charges involve interstate transport. We've been a really active state agency on developing a conservation plan. We wrote a conservation plan for Maine to Virginia, a big core part of the wood turtles range. We standardized search protocols within this region, and Massachusetts was the sort of lead state that held the other states together in a federal grant process. And one of the things we did was, again, working with Liz Wiley on this case, we built population models that suggested where we think the wood turtle has been so substantially impaired that we don't think the populations are viable anymore. So if you look at Massachusetts in red, you can see that the wood turtle, the areas where the wood turtle is probably still doing the best are these big unfragmented and forested areas of western and central Mass. So as part of this, these are all turtles that were photographed 10 years apart. I'm really interested in this. I'd love to know, I can't live long enough to see how long these turtles live, but we catch these little decade snippets. So some of these turtles now we first marked 15 or 20 years ago, and you can see these are turtles, the same turtle 10 years apart. In some cases, you can see measurable wear change to the pigment. In other cases, it's like no time has passed at all. So I could reverse these, and it might be hard to say which of these was taken first. So then the sort of neat thing to think about is if you started working with these turtles in the 90s and it looked like this, it's really hard to say how old that turtle was when you first started interacting with it. So by taking these time series photographs, we're trying to refine our estimate of how long they live by looking at rates of shell wear and rates of depigmentation or pigment loss. And I'll spare you the rest. Okay, so let me see. I'm going to skip some of this, but just to say that we've seen indications by going into Lancaster, where Louis Agassiz worked. I mentioned his work from 1857. In this volume, he says that the wood turtle is so abundant in Lancaster, Mass, that he's collected more than 100 in an afternoon. So we had to go back and look in Lancaster to see what we found. We barely found any, but what we did find was that the turtles there are much, much, much larger. So they're almost 20% longer, which would equate to almost twice as massive, the way turtles are shaped and the way turtles grow. So for some reason, these are Agassiz's turtles at Harvard, and I'll spare you the details. It's actually just been published, and I'd love to talk to you more if you have other ideas. But it looks to us like Agassiz's wood turtles, which are clearly old adults, you can see them here, are smaller than any wood turtles known anywhere in their range today, from Michigan to Minnesota to Nova Scotia to Virginia. Thousands of turtles have been handled and sampled, and none are as small as Agassiz's. So something was very different in the 1850s, and I don't think it's been completely solved. But we think one of the explanatory factors is that it has warmed 3 degrees in central Massachusetts. That's clearly affecting their growth. But what seems to be affecting the actual body size more, or at least it's a correlated variable that's explaining something, is population density. So where we see high density populations of wood turtles, the turtles are smaller. And it's possible that Agassiz's turtles were so small because the densities were so high. Again, I'll spare you some of this just because I'm over time. But I want to share this. If you look at Massachusetts, this is Massachusetts female wood turtles across the state. And the relative age based on carapace wear is on the x-axis, and their size is on the y-axis. And so even today across the state, the oldest turtles are the smallest. And I still think that that's because they grew up under these higher density circumstances 40, 50, 60 years ago. And we're seeing basically a living signature of that. That's sort of a controversial assessment, or not everyone's accepted it, but I think that we're seeing this pattern in more and more related taxa. So let me do this. I won't say any more, but I'll close by just sharing some images of the turtles I haven't talked much about. This is the eastern box turtle at the very edge of a big North American range. There are many different forms of box turtle, from Massachusetts to Yucatan to Campeche. So over most of the North American temperate part of the continent, you can find some sort of box turtle, and they come to an end here in Massachusetts. There seem to be fewer than 10 or 12 in New Hampshire known at the moment, and then the rest of the northern range margin is here in Massachusetts. So again, to me, this is inspiring. It's helpful to see ourselves in a larger picture, and you know, box turtles are having trouble range wide. There's no difference here in Massachusetts. They're one of the longest lived vertebrates in the state. Even though they're so small, they can probably easily live to 80 or 90 years. And again, these are not Massachusetts box turtles I'm showing here, but trying to provide a visual sense of just how diverse the North American box turtles are. That's a subject I love talking about, so I hate to go through it so quickly, but the box turtle is a tricky one. So let me just wrap up by showing images of the musk turtle. Again, this is one I get emails about all the time. People think it's a young snapping turtle, or they just don't know what it is. A younger animal has these 2 beautiful yellow cream colored stripes on its face. This is an old male. It clearly spends a lot of time underwater, and those stripes are long gone in this ancient individual. This was actually I've only seen mating a few times, so this is courtship in the musk turtle down in Plymouth County. And then a favorite of mine, we don't know much about this animal, as common as we think it is, or as widespread as we think it is. This is another species that's found on many of our offshore islands. It's truly found statewide. There are a lot of missing holes in its biology, and luckily there are several partners in Massachusetts that are starting to study it a little bit in more depth, including Brian Bastarash's team at Bristol Aggie High School in Dighton. And a few other teams are starting to look at the snapper a little more closely. In 2014, we closed the commercial harvest on this species, so out-of-state commercial harvest was stopped. This is one to pay close attention to. Again, it's completely unrelated from all of our other turtles. It almost certainly lives as long, if not longer. It hasn't received a lot of really dedicated scientific attention in Massachusetts. Much of what we know about it comes from long-term studies in Ontario and other places. Again, I hope most people listening are already sort of interested in this animal, but it is truly an interesting creature. So this one, snapping turtles or other species in the same genus can be found all the way down to Ecuador. So there are snapping turtles in the southern Yucatan Peninsula. There are snapping turtles on the Pacific coast of Central America, and they go well farther north. So they go up into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So where from here? It's a mix of encouraging and promising signs because there's so many dedicated people working on this at all different facets and aspects of it. What you can do if you're interested and so inclined, you can look for them, report rare species to MassWildlife. There's a joint site between MassWildlife and MassDOT called linkinglandscapes.info that does track road crossing hotspots. The one thing I'd say about that, looking back on 10 years of that effort or more, is that oftentimes if it's a town road and you are really inspired to get something done, you'll be able to move faster than the state. They tend to be able to work where they have jurisdiction over a state layout. So don't feel intimidated by the prospect of approaching your conservation commission, your DPW, and just seeing if there are creative ideas for how to solve a problem. But we definitely welcome any inquiry and would love to try to work with you on creative solutions to reduce turtle roadkill. And that's enough said on that. I've already said it, but I think we need to really maintain laser focus on our most important turtle landscapes, make sure we're coming at those as strategically as possible with as many partners, all hands on deck, and make sure that the landscapes that haven't been kind of fully protected in a way that's helpful, are. The next several decades, we're going to see tremendous change in Massachusetts. Sea level rise will affect important populations. Our populations of terrapins are precisely at sea level and hemmed in by development. A number of our spotted turtle populations are right at the ocean and affected by erosion already. Hurricanes, we've seen mortality associated with major catastrophic flooding. Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene undoubtedly caused wood turtle mortality across New England. And even just the disruption in temperature and precipitation will cause a number of our turtle populations that we've protected to have serious trouble. So this should just be, not to be doom and gloom, but this is going to be a real factor within our lifetimes. And so just a reminder, the primary reason our turtles have declined is because of habitat fragmentation. So working to protect unfragmented landscapes and restore landscapes that are fragmented is really the best way forward. You can email me at michael.t.jones@mass.gov. I know I've gone over time. I really appreciate the chance to do this. And thanks for taking the time to listen.
All right, that's great, Mike. When we have a few questions. Have you got access to the question and answer box?
Oh,
it's the Q&A. It should be lit up red on your.
Yeah, I can see it, but it's not.
Why don't you unshare your screen, and then you may have more screen space.
Okay, sure. Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. So Andrea, Dave, do you want me to just jump in, or do you want to?
Right in on, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I see Andrea's question about what happens to the turtles that are confiscated. This is a really big issue, and I've actually spent a lot of today working on this, but this is, it's different for each species. Luckily for wood turtle, we've genetically mapped most of their range working with biologists at the University of Montana. So if a confiscation shows up, theoretically, we can figure out roughly where they came from, which basin. So we are testing this out right now. We've figured out where a big recent confiscation seems to have come from. It's from 4 states, and we're trying to get those turtles back to those states. What happens then is up to them, but we're trying to establish this workflow where we get the turtles back to where they came from, to the people who would know best what might be a conservation outcome for them. I don't want to overstate what we can do with those animals. It's really important that we keep the turtles in the wild in the first place, because once they come out, they're looking at a pretty bleak future, but we're doing the best we can, I think. Yeah, so Dobie, Dina, I see your question too. Yeah, they're collected for an illegal pet trade. It's really burgeoning in Asia. So Hong Kong is a port of export. A lot of our turtles are being shipped there. Yeah, it's really discouraging. We mark the turtles a number of different ways. Mary, I see your question. Thanks for asking. We do, for decades, researchers have marked the shell. Ironically now, that might actually discourage collectors. There were several big busts in Florida recently where the collectors said that they left turtles in the wild that had shell notches because they're easier to figure out where they came from, easier to demonstrate that they're illegal. So a lot of researchers probably began to feel that that wasn't the best way to mark turtles. It's better to use microchips implanted. They're probably a little less invasive, and you don't need to mark the outside of the turtle, but it seems like there's some chance it's discouraging poaching. But some of our most endangered turtles we're marking with what's called a pit tag, which is about the size of a grain of rice, and we use a syringe to insert it into its leg. And we think that those, if they're properly put in, will stay in for the animal's life for several decades. Yeah, Ruth, I see your question about how territorial are turtles. You can watch them year after year after year after year, and they do precisely the same thing. However, they can also do completely different things. So on average, most of the turtles we talked about do something similar each year. It really seems like the pattern in a lot of our turtles is figure out the landscape, figure out where all the resources are, play that out as long as they can. There's no reason to change it up, but then they're ready to move if something isn't right. So if something changes abruptly in their environment, they don't hesitate to do something completely differently. So if you radio track these turtles for many years, you'll see suddenly an animal that for 10 years or for 5 years didn't do much different, just do something completely different. And it varies by species, it varies by site, it varies by the age of the animal. So it's really pretty variable. And Mary, I see your question about the soft shells. We don't know a lot about the ecology of the soft shell turtle. So yeah, you're good to hone in on the fact that we do have the introduced eastern spiny soft shell. It's in Holyoke in the Connecticut River, probably all the way down to Westfield. It's in Walden Pond. Hopefully it never gets into the Sudbury River. We don't know, but it would be good to find out what its effect is locally, and it would be good to try to minimize its spread in the state. It's a popular food item, and so it probably escapes or is released with some regularity. So the Chinese soft shell is one that has shown up several times in Quincy. It's been in the news. We found them in Lynn. They've been reported in Lynn. So it's one in Malden, Everett, I think. It's one to watch. It's hard to know what would happen, but once it's really established, it would be hard to do something else about it. Is that the? Oh, I see a couple more. Should I keep going, Dave?
Yeah, you get 2 more there, and then we have a couple from the chat line too. So.
Oh, okay. Well, just really, Ruth, I see your question about food being a limiting factor during breeding season or a nesting habitat. A lot of the turtles we talked about that are of conservation concern, this is just my opinion, it seems like the nesting habitat is the limiting factor. Many of the turtles, especially in that group I kept harping on, the wood turtle, the spotted turtle, box turtle, they can feed on land. They're omnivores. They'll eat plants or animals or carrion. And so they can eat pretty much anything they find. Fungi, raspberries, blackberries, jewelweed. They really love impatiens, the little bracken, young bracken. They'll eat milkweed. So they'll eat a lot of bizarre things. Once I saw a wood turtle go into a cornfield in Southampton where a bear had come through, and it was just following the path of the bear, eating corn that was on the ground. So they'll find what's there. One of the problems with the nesting habitat is that a lot of them are being overgrown by really aggressive plant species. So Hurricane Irene, Sandy reorganized a lot of Japanese knotweed in some of our wood turtle streams. And so some nice wood turtle nesting beaches are really thickly colonized with that stuff now. That's tough to get rid of if you've tried to remove it. And Ruth, I see your question about the sex ratio. That's really variable. Site to site, it can skew wildly. All of the turtles we talked about, except for one, have temperature-dependent sex determination. So all of our Massachusetts turtles, the sex of the animal is dependent on what temperature the egg incubates at. The exception in our native turtles is the wood turtle. That actually has a chromosome-determined sex. So you might expect that they'd be more even, but that doesn't even seem to be true. And the soft shells, so that invasive animal that we're concerned about has genetically determined sex, chromosomally determined sex.
Okay, a couple more.
Great. This is good.
Yeah. Yeah, how many Blandings turtles in Mass?
Okay, so this is just a back of the envelope. It's probably somewhere between, I don't know, but the order of magnitude is probably somewhere between around 2,000. Don't hold me to that, but I would guess it's less than 2,000.
Okay, I have a couple from the other thing here I could kind of put together. So people are interested in either creating habitat for nesting wood turtles, or how would you protect nest that's in your yard, let's say, from predators? So kind of two related questions.
Yeah, I know it's hard to watch these old turtles come up and nest and then not do anything about it. I get that. So one thing to remember, a few things, most people who see a turtle nesting aren't actually seeing the nest. They have a lot of behaviors that are exploratory. So they'll dig with their front limbs, they'll dig with their hind limbs, they'll abandon a chamber, they'll do a lot of funny things, and you might think you're seeing the animal nesting. But if you actually see it lay the eggs, the best thing really is to leave them some space. So you shouldn't really know if it laid the eggs or not. That might be too close. Part of that's context. Use your ethical best judgment. If you live in a subdivision and you have a nesting Blandings turtle, I would not want to get too close to that animal because it means it's going to have to come up again the next night. If you live in the middle of nowhere in Warwick and you're the only house on your street, and you've got a wood turtle nesting in your yard, you can imagine there's not as much of a downside. Technically under state law, you're not allowed to harass any of the listed species, so bear that in mind. But it's good to think about what you might do if you found a turtle nesting on your property. Let me tackle that other question for a sec, because you can invest a lot of time and effort in creating a nesting area for turtles. I think in most cases, you want to be pretty sure that they're there. So if you're a really trained naturalist and already know that these turtles are there, first of all, I hope you're reporting them, because it'll also elevate your property for various federal and state habitat grants to do this work. We do see applications sometimes where the person maintains that there are rare turtles there, but there's no record of it in the state database. So that's where it's helpful to have a record where the site's already been mapped and identified as a priority. But given all of that, yeah, you can successfully create nesting habitat, and there are many guidelines and best management practices online.
Okay.
Thanks for asking. Yeah.
There was one comment they wanted to hear more about box turtles and snappers. That's a whole nother event. I expect we could spend on just those species. All right, we're getting down there. All right, so the other question was, is the snapper population increasing in southeastern Mass? The snapping turtle population, are they going up or down or staying steady?
I don't know. It's hard to, right, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's really locally variable. I don't know. They're very hard to study. If you have ever radio tracked them, they move incredible distances. They can also be very sedentary. So they're another one of these animals that is a bit of a mystery. So with the times that I've put radios on snapping turtles, they confused me the next day by moving more than a mile, and we're in a completely different context than I had envisioned. So don't fall into the trap of thinking the snapping turtle that you see is the same one you saw before. It's just as likely a different, similar looking snapping turtle. Try to approach it with sort of a critical, empirical eye, and get a handle on it locally. I don't think they're increasing. But we don't have the sort of programs in place that we have for the rare turtles, where we're actually doing mark recapture to estimate population size. One caveat: we're doing a lot of Blandings turtle sampling with big hoop traps across eastern Massachusetts. So that's basically from Bristol County up to Essex County. We've done tens of thousands of trap nights and captured thousands of snapping turtles. We're not individually marking those in Massachusetts, but the trap capture rate is something that we would be able to compare as time goes along. So it's not a statewide assessment, it's secondary to Blanding's turtle, but hopefully we'll have more, more for you as time goes along, sort of an accessory effect of trying to look really closely at Blanding's turtle.
Good. And just one question from back when we were talking about the perched wetlands on the islands. Are those happening on all the islands, or just Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, or
yes,
how is that happening?
I don't know. So I was just, I don't know. I'd like to know there's a graduate student at Antioch, Kat Lauer, who's looking at this a little more closely. She's specifically looking at the effect of sea level rise on spotted turtle and the various ways it seems to be playing out. So hopefully, again, in a year or two, we know more. We're working with states from Maine to Florida on a conservation plan for spotted turtle that basically helps each state understand what their regional contribution is to the species. It's clear to me that our island populations are unique. There are island populations of spotted turtle in Virginia and North Carolina and Maryland, but ours are significant. And so it would be a shame. I mean, it's important to know. So I don't know. I've only seen it personally on one island. And I think it's on these moraine features, not on the outwash, that this seems to be happening, but there are other erosional problems going on in outwash. There's one other thing. I don't know if I'm making sense, but the moraine is the big piled up material that has more topography. But one of the things that's happening on all of our coastal areas is the potential for seawater inundation of freshwater marshes, conversion of so there are a lot of places where dams or dikes were put in place, like the Herring River on Cape Cod, that created a freshwater system. There's a lot of interest in salt marsh restoration, which in its, intuitively is a good thing because we're expecting to lose a lot of salt marshes. But along the way in that process, we'll lose some freshwater wetlands that have probably stabilized in the last century. So it's going to be a big, complicated century,
Good. And I just see a couple of things. I will post your talk on the bog turtle to the Alpha Alberta Club newsletter so that people can find that.
Okay, great.
And then that person asked about which island was having the perched wetlands being destroyed is from Nantucket, so they were curious specifically.
Oh, you know what? Just because this is going to be posted, if you don't mind sending me an email, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But it's a place that I wouldn't want to call too much attention to the spotted turtle population there. So,
very good. All right, I think we're pretty much there. Does anybody have any other questions that we can have Mike try to answer? And again, we really appreciate Mike taking the time to do this with us, and we do appreciate the Grassroots Foundation for funding our ability to do this electronic stuff that we're all just beginning to learn how to use. So really thank everybody for joining us. And we did max out at the 101 attendees at our high point. So we may need to get a bigger attendance list. So, all right. So,
yeah, thanks.
Last words, Michael, you're all set?
Thanks for including me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, that'll do it for us. And everybody enjoy the night and look for turtles and help them get across the road. All right. Thank you much.